welcome to Aimless Ramblings. We're three men who have known each other for an inordinately long period of time, essentially mentally masturbate over a series of different concepts and topics and discuss them in varying degrees of understanding. My name is Tim. I am the one who sort of came up with partially this idea for this concept. On the other hand, I'll throw to my brother Simon and one of my best and closest friends, Sam, shortly to discuss some concepts from their own point of view. Now, in this inaugural opening episode, I want to discuss a concept that's very close to my heart, and that's conversation and the value of conversation. Now, I really sort of began my other series, which is my video series, Foolish Musings, because of the long and in-depth and mentally stimulating conversations that I had with both my brother and my good friend over numerous different aspects of life, society, and pretty much every other aspect of life and how they all interrelate. I'm sure Sam could say something of my conversations and their quality.
Was it don't say anything if you don't have something nice to say?
Exactly. And once again, for years, basically, I've on a weekly basis been having long, in-depth conversations with both these guys. And so today, I want to discuss what is the intrinsic value, or if there is intrinsic value in conversation. So, for my point of view, with historically speaking, you've seen a lot of thinkers, both from the East and from the West, have discussed conversation as kind of being either productive or unproductive. And it's actually surprising because we see from two of the greatest thinkers of these two traditions, so in the West, Aristotle, and in the East, the Buddha, there's almost like a confluence of thought when it comes to conversation. So Aristotle, when he's talking about conversations between friends as part of his discourse on friendship, he talks about how one of the most valuable forms of friendship is when you have a superior friend and an inferior friend, and the benefit that is essentially gained from the conversation comes from the friend who is inferior essentially being taught or being brought up to the same level of the superior friend. And in some ways, that's reflecting some of Aristotle's Platonic influences. In Plato was very much about the dialogues and about approaching truth through discourse. But it's really sort of this idea of a transference of knowledge. Similarly, with the Buddha and the Buddhist tradition, there is a sort of a long-standing debate and argument suggesting that realistically, there's three kinds of conversations: the conversation between the enlightened persons, a conversation between two unenlightened persons, and a conversation, one of which is unenlightened, one of which is enlightened. And so, in Buddhist philosophy, the only real valuable conversation out of those three is one between an unenlightened and an enlightened person, because two enlightened people would already really understand what the other person was going to say, so they don't really need to have a conversation. And two unenlightened people talking, essentially, it's noise. It's not really creating any sort of valuable production. I'll probably leave it at that in terms of my introduction, because I want to tease out some ideas in that more broadly, because I don't necessarily think in reality that's true. I think a conversation is more of a gem tumbler effect, but I'll be interested to see what Sam has to say on his take on conversation.
G'day, Sam. Yeah, I mean Aristotle, what a man, eh? We won't get into that, but I think wrong about more than he was right. So, anyway, I figured I'd take my take on the value of conversation with the person you have most conversations with, yourself. So I was just going to, talk a little bit about internal monologue, which is self-conversation. So really bad notes, so I apologize. But so I was looking at when do people tend to most converse with themselves, and the most common one actually is when you're driving a car, which is interesting. But I assume that's because you're engaged physically in an activity, so your brain just kind of wanders and such. But often, if you're day-to-day life, you're not actually conversing with yourself. You're just existing in what I like to think of more of an animalistic state instead of consciously conversing. So if you're making plans, problem solving, self-reflection, or critical thinking, that's when we tend to talk to ourselves, essentially. So these internal monologues of ours are integral for our ability as a species to come to where we're at. It doesn't look as though reading, which is subvocal vocalization, I guess, is the same as internal monologue. Because if you look at the parts of our brain which are activated during these, when we're reading, it's essentially actually our where are we? I wrote it down somewhere. It's a certain part of our brain that's where is it? I can't. Anyway, it's one of the gyri in our brains, and it's the one that's used for processing audio stimuli. So when we're actually reading, our brain is treating it as though we're hearing it. Whereas when we're conversing with ourselves, it's actually just the social, in air parentheses, side of our brain that's activated, not actually our auditory cortexes. So that's interesting. The argument I was hoping to make, and I feel like I'm poorly making it, was that it appears as though internal monologue comes from and is derived by external monologue. So in children, they think, it's really hard to study because how can you tell if a person is thinking to themselves? But it appears as though children begin, when they're quite young, to not have it. They'll be conversing with adults first, or other children first. Then they do what's called vocal self-talk, which is where they'll, talk quietly to themselves about their thoughts. Like, I need to go and do this, but they're vocalizing. And eventually that stops being vocal and is solely an internal thought. So if it's responsible, for problem solving, advanced planning, self-regulation, all this type of stuff, internal monologue coming from external monologue, or external conversation, sorry, kind of leads to the fact that the value of conversation is we may not be conscious without it. Possibly, slightly grasping at straws, but
yeah,
that's what I figure at least. If we didn't converse, we wouldn't converse with ourselves, and so we wouldn't have the ability to self-reflect, etc. Something along those lines.
No, yeah, interesting. Simon, do you want to go on with? You wanted to talk a little bit about the value of when conversation breaks down, I think, didn't you?
Yeah. So my basic breakdown from, as you were talking before about like children talking to themselves, humans in their basest needs, the reason why we've survived as long as we have is our ability to talk between entities. So we're not particularly strong by ourselves, but as a community, that's where we gain our value. And I think the value of conversation, which is the major thing that we're trying to argue, actually doesn't come from being particularly strong conversing. It's not falling into the pitfalls of conversation, because especially in individualist cultures that especially us three live in, and not a collectivist culture, it's very easy to have one's own thought patterns come to the forefront when it comes to trying to get what you want. And that results in a breakdown of the two major elements that conversation is built off, which is the ability to get your point across speaking, and then your ability to collect that information and like synthesize it with your own conversation. And by doing so, you sort of are able to like build understanding between the two entities. That doesn't only have to happen like through auditory thing. It can also happen like through nonverbals and a lot of other stuff. Surprisingly, this leads to a point. I don't know how relevant it is to this particular discussion, but if you want to find if somebody's lying, talk to them on the phone, because the easiest thing to pick up when lying is actually through auditory things. People always like, oh, well, they got a tick or something that you can visually see. That's actually much harder to pick up than actually any form of like verbal cues. However, conversations break down for multiple reasons. And most of this is like attributed to what we like to call noise. That can be like actually physically noisy. Like, if you're on the dance floor, it's going to be much harder to converse between two entities. But that can also be like emotional, like mental noise. So bringing it back to Sam's point about self-talk, in a lot of ways that still drags forth when you're talking to others, in the respect that, like, if you're in a really bad mood, you're not going to be as engaged in the conversation, and as such, the conversation really won't have as much value. And in some ways, it actually has a negative value to the person you're talking to, because they start assuming that you have no interest in the topic that they're talking about, where you might actually have that interest. It's just you can't physically deal with it at that time. And then the thing that I think has really shown through this particular recording is when you're verbally having a conversation, it's very hard to curate your thoughts.
Amen.
However, online you can very easily curate your thoughts, and I feel like that's why it's created almost like this like two-party system of people that will only discuss things in person versus these people that they refuse to actually discuss things, and they always like to send emails and do this sort of stuff because it makes them feel like they're more in control of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing so, I feel like they lose out on a lot because they think, oh wow, I'm safe because I can say what I want and I can look up, all the smart quotes and all the kind of stuff to back up my point of view. However, at the same time, it undermines, because they are also building this kind of sort of relationship between the person they're conversing with. They go, oh, okay, so that's the kind of person they are. So then when they get called out on it, it breaks down all these relationships that have been built through the discussion. So by breaking that down,
online relationship.
Yeah, pretty much. The best example of how this curated relationship comes to a T is romance scams. Romance scams are like the pinnacle of utilizing this. I was reading a really interesting thing. In Nigeria, you actually study as a course, being able to do scams. Scams are actually a course that is taught by the Nigerian government in schools.
That's brilliant. I gotta wonder, what percentage of the GDP this contributes.
Yeah, it's a massive element of their GDP. It just comes straight from scams. So yeah, my basic takeaway from the value.
Yeah, I was just saying that's fascinating. In terms of an entire economy based upon scamming being actually almost semi-legitimized by the government.
Yeah.
Not casting
at the end of the day,
Nigerian. No.
Yeah, the Nigerian princes are now becoming Nigerian telemarketers. But yeah, so yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. That conversation really comes from the value of pure conversation versus this sort of the pitfalls and the the artificial elements of conversation.
Yeah,
no, well, I mean, you go, Sam.
No, I was just saying I like that. It's a nice concept.
Yeah. So I sort of touched on it when I introduced, or towards the end of when I was doing my introduction there. But in some ways, I really think conversation and realistically interaction between two entities, as Simon's put them out, kind of, in my mind, it's more of a gem tumbler effect than what has been the historical conception of conversations of value. Because, and Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of scientific and sociological advancements have occurred not because one person has known something and is transmitting this received knowledge to another, but from the different ideas and minds bouncing off each other in debate.
Well, I'd argue a lot of it's just fucking chance, but yeah, that too. Or
in that case,
other people's ideas.
Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, I personally feel like it's less of a gem tumbler effect and more of early Darwinism, where it's just sort of two things are meshed together to create something different, and then from that it's sort of chopped and changed and then that's mixed with a new match of things, and then that's how we gain new knowledge. Like, I don't particularly do a lot of hard sciences, but from what I understand, a lot of the cases, it's just somebody goes, oh, I have a completely different idea, so let's add it to the function of work, which then has a ripple-on effect throughout the whole entire, like, bridge of knowledge in that particular area, and results in a completely different outcome. So it's less that, oh, wow, we're chipping off the edges, and more that we're just mixing more and more things together until it stops being the thing it originally was. Like,
Yeah.
Freudian theory has stopped being a valid thing years ago, but we still use it as, like, the starting block, because people are like, we want to prove you wrong.
Mm.
And by proving them wrong, they created all these different fields that sort of just get meshed together with, like, well, I like this element of this part of psych and this element of psych, and then combine them together to create a new element of psych.
Mm.
But yeah, I don't know if that extends outside.
I was going to say, one thing I have read is Thomas Kuhn's concept of scientific paradigms. It's like the idea that a scientific model exists and it continues to exist, and people conducting experiments within this scientific paradigm up until the point that the weight of evidence is such that the paradigm no longer works, and then there has to be a paradigm shift, which is where a new model is proposed. And so there's realistically two types of work, or two types of a conversation, I suppose you could say. One which is trying to work within the paradigm, and one which is trying to work outside the paradigm and produce a new paradigm which supersedes the old one. But
Even then, I
Sam?
wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Like, a lot of it is, like, paradigm shift tends not to be, wipe out everything we've ever learned, start again. It's more so, okay, this aspect of this isn't necessarily right. So it's more, think of it as a sphere, and you push, or bubble or whatever, and everyone's pushing at the edges. Instead of the bubble popping and you make new bubbles, it just tends to stop being nice and spherical, and you get weird indentations, and everything gets a little bit ugly until someone can draw a new bubble around it all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, classical physics is still used today in terms of, basic engineering. We don't use modern physics in terms of, curvature of space-time and that when we're trying to build buildings.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah. So Sam, do you think there's any point though at which a conversation can, like for instance, a self-talk conversation could become harmful, and there would actually be negative value in that self-talk?
Literally what schizophrenia is.
I would
as well, but yeah. So,
I'd personally argue it's less schizophrenia and more probably depression, anxiety has a stronger element of self-talk being a negative. I personally find.
Audio vocal hallucinations are self-talk, and so essentially when a schizophrenic hears a voice, it's their own brain, obviously. So it has to be, by definition, self-talk. So yeah, I think we have a system that works for the most. And when this system doesn't work, shit gets whacked.
And I think one of the things Simon said a few times is that it's not so much that the actual person themselves is any sort of measurable, you are bad, you're dysfunctional. It's just the fact that you aren't able to function in a social setting.
Kind of by definition, that is dysfunctional.
Yeah. Would you say that, Simon?
You don't want to give attributes to it, but by definition.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this whole entire thing of, ironically, most of these studies are based on the very weird and self-constructed thing of what is social norms. And as long as you have social norms that, the best example of this is, we're currently on the DSM-5, but the DSM-4 still considered homosexuality a mental disorder. So up till that point, quite literally, you would be treated the same as if you had schizophrenia, because it was like, okay, this is actually severely affecting you from a social standpoint. So we need to sort of assist you in not being against that status quo, as mentioned prior. But yeah, we haven't completely thrown out the DSM. We've just altered it in the respect that, yes, there is a thin line to walk between, being transgender and being quite literally having body dysmorphia.
Mm.
And, where do you draw that line? And that's the same with conversation. Like,
so you go,
imagine
Tim?
people body dysmorphic, as in transgender people. If you offered them a pill that would make them happy with who they physically were, I think a lot of them would probably be quite happy with that.
Indeed.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. No, I was going to say, so from both your perspectives, how do you think that we can have better conversations? Because we've talked sort of about, I suppose, from a self-talk perspective, and they've talked from how there's some pitfalls in conversations. So how do you think we can better employ self-talk, and how do you think we can better understand and avoid these pitfalls? Sam?
Mental ease. That's what we need. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, mental ease. Which is like the theory or whatever, hypothesis that we think in a language. It's not not English, it's not Chinese, it's not German, it's not French. It's the way the brain is structured results in a certain pattern of thought, and that is mental ease. So once we all can vocalize mental ease, we'll be fine, because we'll be speaking the same language for a change.
That's an interesting one, because people do talk about the idea that your ability to transmit meaning is fundamentally shaped by the language and grammar that you use. So you're obviously always communicating through a lens.
Umwelt?
Yeah, your worldview, yeah.
Yeah, like your personal experiences, your lived life gives each word a slightly different weight or a different meaning. But in terms of mental ease, that in theory should be part of it. So if I say cat and I actually hate cats, I don't actually, cats are gorgeous, anyone who listens and wants to try and murder me. Say hypothetically, I hate cats. When I say cat, that hatred of cat is part of that, but it's not expressed, it's just the word. In mental ease, it would be cat, creature that is despised and hated because when I was 6, one scratched me. So that information would also be transmitted. But that's psychology, so talk to Simon.
And so what about you, Simon, from your perspective?
From my perspective, I feel like it's the good old battle between like treating the symptoms and not the disease. When it comes to, because obviously there's stuff like accents will affect, like for example, a deep Texan accent. It doesn't matter how many PhDs they have, they're still going to be treated as if they're somewhat dumb because that's a socially accepted, shorthand. And there's always that, oh well, they're speaking English as their second language, so that means that they're not going to be at the same level, and their accent won't be understandable and whatnot. However, I feel like even if we had all the everybody had the Babylonian language, ironically, I feel like one of the worst things for conversation was actually bred out of teaching small children turn taking. In the respect that they just said you have to take turns. They didn't explain why you need to take turns. They just said, I said so you got to take turns. They didn't understand that that's not you going, okay, I'm going to just wait until I can say what I want to say, and then I can enter back into the conversation.
Right.
It's actually a point where you're supposed to go,
shut down.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. I just want to sit, I want to have this discussion. And I come from the nerdy background of actually, liking doing, like, in the simplest form, counseling is pretty much doing the exact opposite to what you're built to do, which is you just listen and you try and force as much information out of the other person and put none of your own input in. Because you don't want them to know anything about you. Because since they know something about you, they'll use it as leverage. So you listen. But this turn taking was established is, okay, you get to talk, then I get to talk. Then you get to talk, then I get to talk. It wasn't, you get to talk and I'll listen. Then I'll take what you've said and I'll talk and listen. And then spew back something that's actually responsible to what you've talked. And then the conversation goes somewhere. Like, so many times people have skipped the middle step.
So
they skip that middle step
You go, Simon.
I feel like that's beautiful, considering what you're just talking about, Simon.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm really, again, this leads back to the whole entire like human interaction. Like if I had the visual cues of Tim doing a particular thing, I'd be like, okay, cool, he's going to talk, so I'll wait and I'll listen. And I feel like personally the reason why this conversation even works is because we have that understanding of turn taking is not just I wait until I can talk. We have this whole I wait, I take in what they're going to say, and then I go, actually I have more questions about this. And I think that's what the backbone of academia really is. Well, what should be the backbone of academia is not just coming from your standpoint, but seeing where they came from, and
which, as you said, is kind of like going against what we are raised to do as children, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like the old two ships in the night effect, where people are just talking past each other rather than talking with each other. It's just about an expression of one's own identity rather than a real attempt to engage with what the other person has actually said. So realistically for me, I think one of the hardest points in terms of from a philosophy or a ethics, or even just from like just doing pure analysis, which is my day-to-day job, one of the hardest things I always find is when you're having a conversation with somebody who has already decided upon an opinion, and they're just set in their ways, and they're essentially closed themselves down to the option of looking at something from a different angle, which I think Simon pretty accurately described there as one of the issues of people sort of just expressing themselves without sort of coming to some sort of coming to the party, really, in terms of a conversation. They're not there to talk. They're there purely to express themselves.
I guess they're there to talk, but not there to have a conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do we think that, or do either of you have any sort of personal experiences, or do you think you could talk about from your own personal experience or from what you've read, ways that we can get around this? And actually, something I would be interested, Sam, from your perspective, do you think that we can tackle our own biases and our own ingrained sort of thought patterns through self-talk?
Probably not, no. Like, for instance, I think Aristotle's a wanker, and I don't think there's anything anyone will ever be able to do that will demonstrate otherwise. And I formed that opinion when I was probably 10. Well, not quite 12 or 13, no? I think it's stuff that is primarily a foundation as such of your personality is very unlikely to change, because people's key personality aspects tend not to change over a lifetime. Obviously, excluding traumatic events, because that can fuck everything up. But yeah, I think there are some things, like if you're a bit of a tosser, you could probably be self-aware enough, hopefully, to shape it, because that's an aspect of self-talk or internal monologue, is your ability to have a conversation with yourself. And so you'll have the two viewpoints within your own head. So if you're a self-aware wanker, you may be able to make yourself a little bit less of a wanker through self-reflection. But I don't think a whole lot, truthfully.
Fair enough. Simon, you got anything to throw in on that one?
Yeah. He did touch on some pretty solid stuff. So the whole entire concept that like people can't really change, and in my field we sort of discussed that. My field, God, I sound like an absolute tosser, like you mentioned.
But it's okay, you can't change that.
Yeah, I can't change that I'm a tosser. But yeah, one of the really interesting parts to that is there's this whole entire concept of discrepancy. So we have the self-identity of what we think we are. So there's like 4 different ideas. There's the Johari window, as we like to discuss it. It's like what we know about ourselves, and we only tell ourselves. There's stuff that we share with others, and there's stuff that's unknown to us, and there's stuff that's only known by people who observe us. And it's like, depending on the relationship and...
Are the last two exclusive? Stuff unknown to us, stuff only known to others. Okay, yeah.
So there's stuff that's unknown to anybody. That's what I was referring to. So there's stuff like that nobody knows. But then there's elements that only other people know about us, that we're like, we actually didn't know that. And there's this whole entire thing that, like, when relationships reach a particular point, sometimes people inform them of things that they weren't aware of, and it goes into this like nice shared space. But people's perceptions of themselves can't deal with that. So you have to sort of... The best example I came up with was there were these highly Islamic-phobic individuals, and they really didn't like them. So they were like, aha, I know what we're going to do. We're going to introduce you to a bunch of Muslim people, and, they found out they were really nice people. However, what happened was rather than them going, okay, Islamic people aren't that bad, they went, okay, well, there's nice Islamic people, but all the rest of them are really bad.
Yeah. The classic, I hate every Islamic person except for these five. These five are great.
Yeah, exactly. Because they couldn't physically go, okay, cool, this is so ingrained part of me, I can't go, okay, well, I'm going to change everything I view. It's like, okay, how can I make this work with my mindset? Okay, well, these people are outliers, so we'll just, set them over there. I like these people. The rest of them, though, how we go.
I wonder if that evolutionary backing. Xenophobia is an incredibly successful evolutionary tool. If we're just drivers for DNA, is the inability to change any of our fundamental points of view actually a survival trait? It's just a bit shit nowadays.
I definitely feel like it's weirdly covered well in a feminist novel by Simone Beauvoir, The Other Sex. And I feel like what happened was they released it, and everybody's like, oh, well, that's cool feminist literature. But they never actually, extended that outside of the gender battle. And I feel like it has a really interesting application when it comes to, back in primitive world, it was probably very useful to know the other. But the major flaw I find is that the only way that humans existed was between tribe breeding. So as such, how do we draw that line?
I think there is definitely I think that the structure has to have some sort of malleability in it. Our mental structures do change over time. You're right in the sense, I suppose, that the fundamental underpinning foundations can't be too fungible. Otherwise, the whole entire thing is going to fall apart from a personality and identity perspective. But if it's completely inflexible, it can't take advantage of potential developments as well. I think that we're really touching on some interesting ideas there in terms of identity. And it would be interesting to tackle them probably at a later stage, but we're fast running out of time. Sam, Simon, thank you very much for having a conversation about conversation with me. And hopefully we'll talk again next time.
Easy.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.